All right. It's more intimate now. It's nice. All right. Nice to have you here. Nice to have you interested in grazing for changing our environments into something better. My name is Anders. I come here from Norway last night. I'm working as a representative for a organization called the Savory Institute. We are an organization working on restoring ecosystems globally. And one of the tools that we have found to do this in a good way is by using grazing animals. I come from a farm myself, potato and grain production, and after many years in that farming system I changed over to animal husbandry and is currently running a small farm with 60 sheep on 9 hectares of land. And we're trying to use our farm as a model for best practices of grazing and land management. So I run the farm together with my wife, and we also have 3 children. And for the last years we have been very occupied with starting up a new school in our local community, because we think it's very important that we find ways for people to live out in the countryside, in local communities. I'm going to start talking about something that's not so pleasant, and it's a very the dramatic changes we are experiencing in the climate worldwide today. We are experiencing serious flooding, and in one part of the world, while in other parts of the world we are experiencing severe droughts. And both of these things are aspects of the same thing. It's a broken water cycle. So the water that ends up in one place should have been somewhere else. So there's something that is out of balance. The one thing is the ecological problems with this. Another problem is that it leads to humanitarian disasters worldwide. The war that has been occurring in Syria for the last years is partially because of a 10-year drought that they were experiencing before the war. And if you don't have food, things start to escalate. So what we are experiencing is environmental malfunctioning. Something is wrong with the ecosystems. And our organization is trying to do as much as we can to rehabilitate the land and get a functioning photosynthesis again, green plants growing. And as we can see from the map, there's huge areas of land today that are not active photosynthesis. Lucky for you, you are in a part of the world that is very forgiving. So what we do to the environment here will not end up with a desert. But we can experience the same symptoms of not functioning ecosystems. And as farmers, this is something that we can tap into. It's a very good potential for us to increase the production on our farms. Oh yeah, there it is, sorry, it's the wrong screen. All of this environmental malfunctioning comes from one same cause. Is this one thing that is leading to all of this. And the problem is us and how we are making decisions. Because the decisions we make in our everyday life is what guides the outcome of our actions. I'm going to cut down a lot of the information today into focusing on regenerative grazing practices, but it's very important for me to say that what I'm going to talk about is not a system that you can apply. In farming, we are very accustomed to getting new practices, new tools, new management techniques, and we take them, like for many centuries we have been taking models from the Western Europe countries down to Africa and trying to apply them there, and it hasn't been working, and we have lots of catastrophic results from this. So all of these different systems that we try to apply, they cannot comprehend the complexity that we are experiencing. And every farm is unique. Every farmer is unique. So every farm needs their own approach to how to handle the complexity within their frames. So we're not talking about a regenerative grazing system. We are trying to talk about grazing towards an environmental outcome, because it's all of the names that we can put into different systems, they are of no value if you are not actually achieving what you want to achieve. So we are putting now our own description on how we want the environment to be in the future. How does it have to look to sustain us in the future? And then we have to take our management and use the right tools in order to get us there. And we also have to be, honest to ourselves that if we are actually moving in the direction that we are moving. If we want to create a future resource base, a future landscape, we also need to know how the ecosystem functions. And that's one of the things that I'm going to talk about now. And we also need, when we know how the ecosystems function, we also need to know what kind of tools we have in our disposal to manage these ecosystems. Yeah. The framework that we are working with in our organization is a tool that we call holistic management. It's a very confusing word, this holistic, but it's a very pragmatic approach to dealing with complex systems. The word holistic means that we are trying to take into account everything. Because in nature and in humans and in the environment and as well as the economy, everything is part of each other. If you take out one part, something will happen. You will have consequences. So the whole concept that we are working with is based on three legs. It's the social aspect, it's the economical aspect, and it's the ecological aspect. Because we have such short time, I will not have the opportunity to focus on the social and the economical aspects, which are equally important as the ecological aspects. But we can take that another time. That's the only thing that is truly regenerative. There are so many good farms that are having amazing effect on the environment, but they go broke after a few years and they will have no possibility to continue. Or like the farm that I grew up on, that was really good on economy. They had major turnover on the farm, but the social aspects turned into none of the children wanting to take over the farm, so the farm ceased to exist. Yes. this is the framework that we are working with, and so it's a lot more than grazing. It's a process of working through different indicators. We try to pull everything apart so that we can understand what everything consists of, and then we put it together into a future model that we are working towards. The basis of our model of working is some key insights that you sort of have to understand before you start working with environmental management of ecosystems. And the first one is which we mentioned, that you have to understand that nature is not put together by parts, it's a functioning whole, and it works as a whole, and it also works after certain patterns that are repeating itself. Another key aspect is to understand that environments function differently according to how humidity is distributed. So in some parts of the world, we have a lot of humidity in seasons, and in other seasons there are no humidity. This is a very important insight because in these areas of the world is where the grasslands have been degraded and into these deserts. And the really important thing here is that the key to rehabilitating environments like this is within the animals that are destroying them. Because the only way you can keep humidity and keep plants to decompose through the air is in the rumen of the animals. That's where the microbes are still living, and that's where you keep nutrients breaking down when you don't have the distribution of moisture. Another very important aspect is understanding the relationship between grazing animals and the predators that have been hunting them for millions of years. Together, they have evolved in a symbiotic relationship that affects the soil and the grass to grow. Without this symbiotic relationship, the grass will not grow. The grass cannot exist without grazing. Then you will have a vegetation shift, either towards forest, as we can experience here, or towards deserts, as you can experience in the areas of the world with less moisture. It's important not to think that this is something that is only occurring in the dry parts of the world. It's also something we experience in our northern climates, where we have these huge packs of reindeer traveling the landscapes. The last major insights that we sort of have to know before we start is the importance of time. For very many years, it's been attributed to animals that they are degrading the environment, and that if you have a lot of animals, they are putting more stress to the environment than few animals. But it has nothing to do with the amount of animals. It has to do with the time the animals are present. So in this context, you see sheep scattered around in a huge mountain area, and they are grazing plants, going for the best bite they can find. And the individual plants in this landscape will not have the time to recover before the sheep come back and graze it again. And when you come back and graze a plant over and over and over again, you will stress it, and the root mass of the plant will deteriorate. And after a while, you will get, it's not so easy to see now, but you will get areas where the grass is dying off because you have stressed it out. So by not understanding how time affects, even a small amount of animals can deteriorate a landscape. To contrast this, if you have few animals for 1,000 days, and then you shift to a few thousand animals but just for one day. You are not stressing the plants, you are just eating them once and then moving away. That means that all the plants in one area have the time to recover before you come back. Another thing is when you are concentrating animals like this, you are also disturbing the soil. And disturbance in soil is important to get seed germination and also to get moisture into the soil. And you are also covering the soil by trampling grasses and vegetation that is on the ground. So when you have covered the ground, you will also keep the moisture inside from evaporating out. If you have been in the summertime on the hottest day in the summer, and you go out into the courtyard where the sun has been baking, and you put down a piece of plastic, it will only take a few minutes before it's a lot of water under the plastic. So the soil is always giving off a lot of water. So when we use our animals to trample down vegetation, we put a lid on it so that we can keep the moisture and keeping the soil productive. Another thing is that when you are gathering animals in a large herd, you are grazing off the plants and at the same time fertilizing them, so that the plants that are being grazed is also being fertilized at the same time. Those were some of the key insights before we go into the ecosystems. A strange thing that I've been thinking about in my life in farming is that farmers, they are living off nature. They are harvesting resources out of nature, but very few farmers understand how nature is functioning. So if you are working as a mechanic, you know very well how a car is functioning. But in farming, most of the knowledge seems to go from one generation to the other, and so on and so on. And it's based on a lot of experiences, but not necessarily on knowing how things work in practice. So what we try to do is, instead of pulling out an academic approach to all the ecosystems, where we divide ecosystems into wetland ecosystems, forest boreal ecosystems, mountain ecosystems, we try to see them as one ecosystem. That the whole planet is one ecosystem, but we look at the ecosystems from 4 different windows. So no matter what kind of, if you are in a desert or in a wetland or in a mountain, it's the same processes that are functioning within these ecosystems. The first one is the water cycle. The water cycle is how water is traveling through the landscape. From rain going down, mountains, some of it runoffs of the surface, some sieve into the ground, and some go into the groundwater, into freshwater beds and into the oceans, and evaporate up again. So our job as farmers is to store the water in our landscape in the best possible way, so that we can utilize it for production. From our pasture walks today, we have experienced that water can also be a limiting factor by being too much water. And it's the same procedure. We need to know how can we make the water function best in our landscape. What can we do to keep the soil from becoming waterlogged. We are today losing I cannot remember the figures, but we are losing several tons of soil every year for erosion. And this is a really big problem globally today. So what we can do with the water cycle, we can make sure that we have living plants with the best possible root system, so that the more roots we have, the more water we can absorb. If we have a very shallow root system, the plants will suffocate easier if there is a lot of water. And the deeper we have the roots, the more they can both sustain drought and also flooding. The more roots, the more humus and organic matter we get into the soil, and they will also hold the water 10 times their own weight. And this is what is starting to stabilize the whole global water cycle. Keeping the water in the soil also have a very great cooling effect on the earth. So talking about the global climate becoming warmer, by increasing the soil's capacity to hold water will dramatically cool down the planet. The next aspect of the ecosystems is the mineral cycle. The mineral cycle is how nutrients are broken down in the soil, and how effective this cycle is. For us to have a good breakdown of minerals, we also need microbes in the soil. The microbes is the ones that are breaking down material into nutrients that can be available for plants. When you have soils with very little microbes, we need grazing animals which have this big microbe tank in their stomach to fill up the soil again with microbes. We can also contribute to a good mineral cycle by having a diversity of plants with a diversity of roots going down, picking up different nutrients. The grazing animals also have with their what's it called? Manure. The manure also contains acids that will help break down rock and releasing nutrients from the rocks. So we are talking about the global problem of phosphorus in the world, that we are losing the phosphorus reserves, that they will only last for 50 more years. But we have so much phosphorus in the soils that will become active if we stimulate the microbes in the soil to release them. Most farmers grow grains and annual crops that only pull their nutrients from the top 10 centimeters. And then we need to add external nitrogen and nutrients from outside. But if we can manage to get crops that build more and more root mass, we can tap into that reservoir. Within the mineral cycle, we are talking about a soil food web, and that's all the organisms that are living inside the soil. And they say that we know more about the species in the oceans than we know about the species in the soil. There are a composition of fungi and different nematodes and bacteria, and we want to have as many as possible. So our job as farmers again is to stimulate the soil and feed the microbes, because the microbes will not live if we don't give them something to eat. And we do that by adding animal manure and also trampling down vegetation so that they can break down. The third window into the ecosystems is what we call the community dynamics. Community dynamics is how the different species evolve together and how they interact. Maybe you have heard the word succession. When we start from bare ground and develop into forest. The interesting thing is, from bare ground is the absolutely most unstable form for the environment to be in our environment. From here, the soil will do anything it can to cover itself up with vegetation. And this is where we get all the weeds coming in. And it's at the same time where we do all our cropping of grains and potatoes and things. So we are trying to produce our food in the most unstable part of the successional stage. From bare ground, we move into different herbs and then into grasses. And from grasses, if we rest the environment, it will go into more shrubs and younger trees and larger trees, and then the old growth forest. For us as farmers, it's important to know a few things. And one thing is that when it comes to productivity, if we want to manage our farm for productivity, the absolute most productive part is where we have a transition between the grasslands, which is a bacteria-dominated soil, and into the forest, where you have a fungus-dominated soil. So where you have a balance between fungi and bacteria is where you have the most production. Another thing that is interesting is that we've sort of learned that there is competition between species, that they are trying to compete for their survival. But there is much more collaboration between the different species. So what we want to do when we are managing land is to try to manage for as much diversity of species as we can get. One of the reasons is, if you have one type of species, for instance, if we are going to grow a crop of wheat, we have a big population of wheat in a field. But if we put in one pest, it will take out the whole crop of wheat. So if you have a very low diversity of species, if you only have 2 species in a system, the fluctuation in the population in the species will be very large. But the more species that we bring in, the fluctuation in the populations will go down. So we will have a much more stable ecosystem if you have many species. That's why the old forest systems are very stable, because you have diversity in many levels. There's a rule of thumb that they say that for every species that you bring to your farm, 8 other species will come as a result, because they have symbiotic relationships. The last way to look at the ecosystems is through the window of energy flow. How the energy from the sun is utilized in growing plants. Sorry, I didn't pay for that picture. It's we as farmers, we are living from solar energy. We are our job is to get as much out of the sun as possible. So what we can do is to increase the effectiveness of the sun. And we can increase the effectiveness of the sun by getting plants to grow for a longer time on a greater area, and also with greater leaf bigger leaves. The bigger leaves we have, the more sun the plant will capture. And the earlier the plants will start growing in the season, the more sun we will have to collect. And in the longer we get them to grow in the autumn, the more sun we will get. So, and for all the energy we harvest in our plants, this is also energy that is going into animals. More energy into animals will bring more meat, that will bring more energy as meat and milk to us when we eat. And also in the root system, you will also have more energy to the microorganisms in the soil and those who feed upon them. So we try to increase the overall time and area of our plants. Here's a picture from my farm, where this is early. It's in the middle of April. We are working with timing our grazing so that we have grasses recovered and ready to grow in the spring. And we have, if you consider the whole landscape around here, everything is, the trees are starting to grow and the grasslands here are still quite brown. And well, we have already got 10-15 centimeters of grass growing. So this means that we are capturing a lot more sunlight. And the more leaves that we get, the bigger the leaves, the more sunlight we will get, and things will grow much faster. All right, so that's the ecosystem processes. For us to manipulate our ecosystems, we need to know what tools we have available. How we can manipulate the water cycle, the mineral cycle, the energy flow, and the community dynamics. And throughout history, we have had only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 tools to our disposal. We can do nothing without human creativity. Without us having some idea of doing anything, nothing will be done. And we cannot do anything either without some form of money or labor. Someone has to do it, or we have to pay someone to do it, or we have to do it ourselves. So we consider this as tools, but it is mostly just so that we know that these are important aspects. For a very long time, we have considered only one tool, and that is technology. And in farming, it's very often that we look to technology for solutions to everything. And as I like to say, technology has a lot of companies marketing itself, while biological processes have no marketing department, so it's never being marketed. Technology is a really important tool, but what we want to say is that there are also other tools that we can consider. And it's not always technology that is the right tool to get the job done. When we are working with biological systems, it's often smart to think of biological solutions rather than necessarily only technological or mechanical solutions. Technology, when I'm talking about technology, I'm talking about everything from like this glass. This is technology. This could not happen without technology. I could not drink this without technology. Then I will have to go out and drink straight from the stream. This is technology. Everything that we humans make. The next tool is fire. It's one of the oldest tools we have as a species. We have used fire to hunt. That's how we exterminated many of the great animals of the world. The megafauna that's been roaming from Siberia to Alaska all died out because we were hunting with fire. We also use fire to burn off areas of land to reinvigorate growth, or to burn down trees to grow seeds for grain. We use fire to melt steel. Next tool of our disposal is rest, and that is one of the most misunderstood tools that we have, because we use rest to restore ecosystems, but it's not always rest that is the right tool. What we introduce is grazing as a new tool. Not a new tool, but we consider it as a tool, and also animal impact. I'm going to talk more about those tools in a second. We also have the tool of living organisms. Living organisms is baking bread. You need living organisms to make things grow. Cheese, yogurt, beer, wine, and you also have the negative aspects as biological warfare agents, viruses. So sometimes we have to consider, is it the right time to use living organisms? Some advocates today in farming are talking about different microbial liquids that you can pour on your fields to start the microbial activity. Yeah. So when it comes to stimulating the landscape, we need to consider rest as a tool, so that we know that we are resting the right species that we want for the right time, so that we will have the shift in the vegetation that we want. Rest is the balance of grazing. For many years we have considered grazing just as letting animals out and eat food, and then we take them out when we see that there is no grass left. Grazing is a very powerful tool, because it can manipulate large areas of land. And if we want to go in and do the same thing with technology, it will be very costly. So by using grazing animals in the right way, by having them at the right place, at the right time, for the right reason, we can start modifying our environments. An interesting thing about grazing animals, as we were talking about earlier, is that they always go for the tastiest part of what's available for the plants. So if you have grass is growing, in the early stages of the grass growth, as it goes old, the fresh grass is always the sweetest. So the animals will always go to eat the fresh grass. And the older it gets, the less tasty it gets. And when it comes to this point, approximately, they will start rejecting it and go back and eat the fresh shoots. When you have grazed a plant of grass, it takes approximately 3 days for it to start growing again. And animals usually know this. So when they have grazed the plant, and they go and eat something else, after 3 days they will come back and eat this plant. That means that all the other plants that are not being grazed, they are still growing and going into seed and becoming stale. So if we are not controlling where the animals are and what plants are being grazed, we will have some plants being overgrazed and some plants being ungrazed. When we are considering the productivity of our pastures, it is a very interesting observation to see that if a plant is grazed at this level and taken down to, let's say it's 5 centimeters tall, it will grow slowly in the beginning, and the more leaf mass the sun will hit, the faster it will grow. And if you go and graze a plant that is much taller, and you take off the same amount of leaf, it will have a lot more leaf present, and the more leaf, the faster it will grow. So at the for the same time it will take to recover, you will grow much more leaf mass if you graze it in the top than when you take it all the way down. So if your cows are grazing and the plants are 10 centimeters tall, and you are taking off 5 centimeters, you have 5 centimeters left for the sun to hit. But if you take off 5 centimeters of grass that is taller, you take off the same amount of material, but you have maybe 10-15 centimeters left for the sun to hit. And then you will keep the plants in the fast growing stage, and it will recover much faster. Hello. When we are grazing the plants down to only a few centimeters height, something happens also under the soil surface. Like we say, what is above ground is a mirror of what is below ground. So if you walk out into the lawns around the houses and you take a spade and turn the soil, you will have very shallow roots. And if you go out somewhere where you have let the grass grow much taller and only periodically taking it down, and you dig, you will have a much deeper root system. So if we want the energy cycle, the mineral cycle, and the water cycle to function optimally, we need to stimulate the roots to grow deeper. And we do that by not stressing the plants and letting them grow taller, so that you will have more sunlight to shoot down into the roots. And if we don't graze them all the way down, but let them have some leaf surface left, we are not tearing up the root energy that the plants are storing. And then they will grow faster to back, and we will also stimulate for more roots. One of the really fascinating things I like is introducing animal impact as a tool. Animal impact is how animals behave and how their effect on the environment. To give you an example, I like to pull out a thing that they do on the savannas in Africa, where you have big fires in the landscape, burning down millions of hectares of land. And in order to prevent these fires from spreading, they bring in a fire plane that puts out water, but instead of putting out water, they put salt in the water. So they spray a strip of salt water through the landscape, and this salt attracts all the wild animals in the area to come together, and they graze and trample and rub down every biomass in that area, so that it becomes a strip without any vegetation. And when the fire comes, it stops at this barrier because there is nothing there to burn. So it is very important for us to use the animals and their behavior in a way that stimulates the landscape in a good way. You have probably seen how it looks after if you put out salt for the animals, or where you have your water for animals. Around it, it will be very muddy often, and damage to the grass, and that's very common. But we can now start to use this problem into a positive thing. One thing that we do effectively on my farm is we use the animals as a anti-gravitation force to pull nutrients from down and up on top of hills. Because nutrients, all the minerals, they flow with the water, with gravity, and they go down to the river beds and the streams. And that's usually where the animals like to graze. But the animals don't like to lay down and ruminate down by the rivers. They like to go on top, where there's windy and they have an overview, because they are prey animals. So they need to have the overview to look out, so that they're not caught by predators. And when animals lay down on the tops, they get up, and after they have been ruminating, they let out all their manure, and then they go down and graze. So in that way, they bring the nutrients up to the tops and let them out so that they fertilize the tops. If we don't give the animals access to the tops, we get all the nutrients down at the bottom, where we don't want it. And the more nutrient we get, the more weeds we will get. So many of the weeds that we are combating are weeds that love high amounts of nitrogen. So we need to figure out ways to use the animals to transport nutrients in the landscape where we want it and where we need it. And we also need animals to destroy things that we don't want and not destroy things that we do want. If we have a forested area where we need to get more pasture, we can, in the winter, feed our silage bales inside the forest. As we were talking about earlier, the forest have a fungi-dominated soil, but we need bacteria in there for grass to grow. So by feeding animals in the forest, we are bringing bacteria and disturbance to the soil. And when the spring comes, grass will start to establish. Another important aspect of using animals as a tool is in riverbeds and streams. Often the river starts digging into the soil, and you have erosion and gully formation. And by pulling the animals in for a short period in a concentrated area, we can trample the sides of the riverbanks so that they become more even and not straight down as the water has been growing. And a lot of people are talking about we need trees around the rivers to hold the soil in place. But trees, they have big roots, and big roots don't hold soil very well. Grasses hold soil very well, so we need the grasses to grow all the way down to the riverbanks. And the only way to do that is by trampling with animals and grazing there. Or else the trees will take away the shadow out the grass, and you will have the water start digging. In order for us to get this effect of animals, you need to concentrate the animals in some way, and that's what we call the herd effect. Today we have been out in the pastures where some of the areas that we have been visiting have not been touched by animals at all. Big areas of thatchy sedge that's covering the soil, and there's no light coming in and very little grass growing. While on other areas of the pastures, we have small areas that is more dry and the grass is established, and they are being overgrazed because all the animals go there and graze all the time. While you have large areas of land where there has been no animals, no disturbance, and no grass will grow. But if we take all the animals and fence them in for a very short time in this area where you have no grass growing or no photosynthetic activity. You will trample all the dead material, feeding the soil bacteria, getting light in, and disturbing the soil so that you will get things to grow again. So we need to always figure out where can the animals do the most work for us in order to lift the productivity of the landscape. Yeah. When we are working with the framework for developing our landscapes, managing landscapes, in this model we are talking about lifting the future landscape, reaching having a description of how the landscape must be in the future. For us to do that, for us to work with the landscape, we need to know what resources we have available for us to work. So one of the first things we do, we start listing all the resources that we have on the farm. The human resources, the people available, who are the people that are making decisions, because they are the one that is going to lift the landscape. We also have financial resources, the money that is available to us, because without the money there's not much we're going to get done. And we have all the kinds of equipment and natural resources and the skills that people have, that also is a part of a resource base. This is a very important thing to do, because then it makes us more aware of how we can make things happen. And when we know who are the decision makers and what resources we have, we need to figure out where do we want to go. Because if we don't have any direction on where we want to have our farm, where we want our lives to be, because I meet so many farmers that have no idea why they are farming. They just ended up there. Some tradition in the family, or there was not too much questioning on why are we here. So one of the important things that we are talking about is getting a clear conception of what it is you want. We call this the context, which is a mental model that we start guiding our decision towards. And this context is a description of how you want your life to be. What do I really want to do in my life? What is important to me? Because if you don't have that clear, you will be working most of your life not really knowing that you are doing what you want to do. And I meet a lot of farmers that are in that position, that go for big investments, building new barns, because that was what was expected of them, or that was what their advisor was telling them to do. And they did it, but they never really felt that it was the right thing to do. So figuring out what is important to you, figuring out if we are going to reach that type of life that we want to have, what do we have to produce? So if we want a stable economy, for example, many people would say it's important for me to have a lot of money, but what about having a lot of money is important to you? Is it just being rich so that you can show it to people, or is it the safety that comes with having money? You have to explore all these aspects of your life and figure out what does it mean for me to have economic safety? What do I have to do? Okay, I have to start saving, maybe I have to have a budget, maybe I have to have better income control and expense control. Maybe I have to plan more. Yeah, so all of these things you have to have taken into consideration. we're not talking much about this. I'm just showing some a small aspect of it. But what we do need to know at this point is that there is a big need for you to understand how you want your landscape to be in the future. And now we have been talking about the ecosystem processes, how they function. And you have to go out to your landscape and you have to start figuring out how are they functioning now and how do I want them to function. How is the mineral cycling going? Go out in the field and see, is there any decomposition of material? Do I have any microbes in my soils? How is the water infiltrating? Do I have roots that are capturing nutrients? Or are they suffocating by the water because they haven't got enough root arms? And it's really important to do not have a very static impression of what the landscape is. I find it really interesting that often we think that how it is looking today is how it's always been looking. Like, did they really build the pyramids in the desert? Or maybe it wasn't desert there before. So we have some conceptions that the way things are today is how it's always been. So it's important to go back into previous recorded history about your area where you're living. Maybe there are books from the 1800s where they are describing the landscape, what has been there. Maybe you have old aerial photographies showing the landscape in the 50s. Try to get as much information and figure out what can this landscape actually become. There's a very great researcher in Sweden called Urban Emanuelsson, and he has written a book about the cultural landscapes of Europe. And he is writing about how the ecosystems in Europe have been for the longest period of time where we had the most biodiversity, because they figure out these things by excavations and carbon dating bones they find. And they figure out that in one period of time, a long period of time, the whole Europe was a big savanna with oak trees and animals, greater number than you can ever imagine. And the productivity was amazing. So we have to go back and try to figure out what can this landscape be. If you want it to be an oak forest, it could be an oak forest even if it's a pine forest today. So we have to start working towards the things that you want to achieve. Because we are going to live from the environment for a long time, and then we have to make it the most productive that we can. When we have started to figure out where we want to go with our lives and where the landscape has to be in the future, it's time for us to start making decisions. And what we call the context, that is where our decisions are guided. Because without any direction for our decisions, we are just taking decisions randomly. And that's usually how we do. And when we do that, there are always some kind of unintended consequences following that we have to deal with later. So we try to be in advance by having a clear conception of where we want to go, but we are never perfect, so there's always a chance that we as humans miss out on things. So in order for us to be more sure about the decisions we are making, we have made sort of a filtering question sheet so that we can, when we are making big decisions in our lives, that we know that we won't have any side effects when it comes to the financial aspects, the social aspects, and the environmental aspects. Because these are very, very complicated and very, very complex situations. So we need to sort of have some backup. normally when people are making decisions, we have a goal, something that we want to achieve, and we ask ourselves based on our previous experience, is this a good way to go? And maybe we ask other people we know for advice, is this a good decision to do? And we get an answer, and we usually take the answer that we already have decided, and we go for that. And usually it means that we are assuming that the decision is right, and then suddenly when we discover it's wrong, we have to start putting out fires. So what we want to try to do is to have a more extended view of how we make our decisions. So we have this context where we are guiding our decisions, but we also challenge our decisions by asking these questions. So one of the most important things is to ask ourselves, are we actually addressing the cause of the problem? Are we going to the source of the problem that we are seeing? So in the Japanese automotive industry, you are supposed to ask why 5 times before you take an action. And when you ask why 5 times, if you try it, you will suddenly figure out that you get quite deep into the situation. And we are sort of living in a society today where we are treating a lot of symptoms instead of going to the underlying problem. Yeah. So it's not so easy to see here, but the questions we have to ask ourselves, do we address the cause of the problem? And if we are dealing with financial aspects, we have another question going on, the marginal reaction. Does the things that I'm going to do now, does it give me the most return for the time and the money that I put into it? And that's quite important for us to ask. If we want to be farming for a long time, we need to know that it's economically viable what we're doing. That we are actually putting our energy in where we get the most back from it. Am I going to invest in that tractor, or am I going to invest half the money in building that fence and get more out of the land? There's all this consideration when you're comparing different enterprises where you're putting your money. There's two questions about the social and the sustainability of the land. Am I actually going towards what I have described in my future resource base, what I want my landscape to be? Is this action that I'm doing, is it taking me towards this and this future resource base? And are the things that I'm thinking of doing harming the people that I need support of in the future? By putting up a fence here, will my neighbor be angry with me? Or will my family be disappointed if I go for this and that decision? If you are working with a biological system and trying to figure out if you have a problematic species, we have a question that goes for the weak link of the organism. So if you want to combat some kind of organism or having a problem with an organism, you have to figure out at what stage is this organism at its weakest point, because that's when you have to go in. The same goes for the financial weak link. In any business, you will have at any moment of time, you will have a weak link in your operation. And we are talking about 3 weak links. You can have a weak link in your resource conversion. For instance, if you are growing, if you're working with cattle, growing grass is your resource conversion. The next link is the product conversion, producing meat and milk from grass. Am I producing it in the best way? And the last link is a marketing link. Am I selling the products that I'm having? So you have the resources, the product, and the market link. And any operation have these weak links. If you are running a hotel and you want to, for instance, increase, you want to spend money on advertising your hotel, making a nice web page, and getting a new logo for your hotel. But you don't have any problem with not filling up the hotel beds. You have enough people living there. Okay, so maybe advertisement is not necessarily where you will get the most for your money. Well, what about the product you're selling? Is the beds and the rooms and everything nice? Is it a good product to sell? Well, the customers are satisfied, so they come to fill up your hotel beds. Okay, so you don't have a problem in the product base either. But what about the overall running costs of the business? How are your energy bills? Do you have high expenses on, for instance, hot water? Well, always possibility to cut there. So instead of using 1,000 euros on making a nice web page, maybe you should take 100 euros and invest in signs that you can put in your bathroom and ask your customers to shower for a shorter period of time. So we always, in all kinds of operations, you have to analyze to figure out what is the weak link within this enterprise. We need to know that the energy and the money that we are using when we are making decisions, that they come from a sustainable source, and that they are coming from that they are not consumptive. That means that some money that you are using, it comes into an addictive use, that you have to use more and more and more. Also, the source of the money, is it the money that you are thinking of using in your operation? Is it derived from a source where you have a sustainable income stream, or do you have to borrow the money with a lot of interests? That's things you have to take into consideration. You also have to, if you're considering going for two different enterprises, you also have to figure out which one will contribute the most to covering your overhead costs. And all of these questions, they are considering how you think about the actions that you're thinking about doing. But the last one is, how do you feel about doing this action? Because it's so important that we bring in the emotional aspect of our decisions. And if it doesn't feel right to go through with a decision, maybe you have to think about it again. That's a very short, quick introduction to the framework that we are working with. For us to actually be moving in the direction we want to, we need to have a plan. And many farmers are very skeptical about planning, because why do you have to have it's difficult to have a plan because there's so many things that happen, lots of different variables that you cannot control, like the weather is changing all the time. And that is exactly why we need a plan, because you need to plan for the things that you actually know will happen. So the whole concept of planning for us is derived from the British military, where you have a combat planning situation. Because when you are in a war situation, there's so much chaos and stuff that you cannot control. So you have to control the things that you can control. Like, where can I get food? Where can I get cover? How can we get out of here? Where is ammunition? All the things that you do know. Because then you have a much better chance of making good decisions when other unpredictable things will happen. So we have developed a planning process for the grazing, and we have a planning process for the landscape, and we also have a planning process for the financial aspects. Just a short take on the financial planning. It sounds, well, every year we have to do our yearly revision of the finances, and it's not the most intriguing thing we do as farmers. But and we are saying that we have to do more financial planning, and but this planning is actually quite fun. Because it makes us decide ourselves what kind of profit we want from our business. For most people, the profit that we are left with from in our business is what we are left with after we have paid our costs. So we have the income minus the cost, and that's your profit. And a very strange thing is that when I was a student, I had a certain amount of money, and I managed to get by on that. And it was a small amount of money, but I managed to get by on it. But then suddenly, when I started working after studies, I had a lot more money. But for some reason, I just adjusted my expenses. So at the end of the month, I had the same amount of money left, which was very close to what I had in income. So for some reason, no matter how much we earn, we just adjust our expenses to our incomes. So what we want to do is turn that around. And instead of having the profit from our business being what's left after we cover the cost, we say, this is what we earn, and this is what I want for profit. I want 50% profit of what I earn. And by doing that, we put a roof on the expenses that we have available to earn those money. And that's when we start becoming creative. Because for some strange reason, when things starts to be more pressing and difficult, we always find a way to solve our problems. But if we have no pressure and the financials are present, we are not necessarily considering all the options available and being creative enough to find the best solution to get the job done. So the whole planning procedure that we are working with in the financial planning is a way of categorizing all our expenses from the most important, the expenses that you cannot avoid, and categorizing them down to the least important expenses. And when we have decided how much money we have left to earn our profit, then we can start cutting in our expenses so that we get close to the profit that we want to have for our business. A financial planning process also gives us a complete overview throughout the whole year on how we are doing in our finances, so that we don't have this surprise at the end of the year. Another last important thing I want to mention about the financial planning process is a concept that we call a log jam. So every operation, every farm, every business have one thing that is stopping them the most from achieving what they want to achieve. And for many people, it could be, for instance, planning their finances or taking time to do it. Other people can have serious illnesses that they are living with, but not taking seriously and understanding how much it actually affects their lives in achieving the things they want to do. So everybody has what we call a log jam that is preventing them. Well, the log jam is, the expression log jam comes from the timber, when we were floating timber down the rivers. And at some points the timber got stuck, and there was this one log that was jamming all the other logs from flowing down the river. And the second you remove that log, the others will flow, the timber will flow freely again. So we are trying to figure out what and where is the log jam in our operation. that is the most important expense that you have through the year. Finding time and money or whatever it takes to fix that problem. And it's not necessarily being fixed the first year, but you need to allocate money for it the next year. The next planning procedure that we are working with is the land planning. So we've been talking about how we want to develop our future resource base. How does the landscape need to look in the future to sustain us, to have a well-functioning ecosystem? Now it's time to sit down with a map and the team that you are working with, and maybe take in other people that can look at the maps with a different perspective, because we bring with us a very predetermined conception of how the landscapes look, and especially if you have inherited the family farm, things are very static on how we view our farms. That's where my grandfather had his shovel, so it must be there forever. At least that's how it is in Norway. So we are not necessarily being creative about how to move our landscapes ahead. We are also starting to consider how we can utilize our grazing animals in order to shape the landscape in the best possible way. How we can use the animals to move nutrients where we need them. How we can use animals to destroy vegetation we don't want. How we can use them to repair areas of the farm that needs the disturbance of animals. The land planning is something that is a plan that is going to show how the farm is going to be for many years ahead. It's not necessarily a plan that you start implementing at once. When we are starting with grazing planning and land planning, many farmers are very eager to get up a lot of fences so that they can start grazing their land in a more controlled manner. But investing in a lot of fencing just because you have learned new ways to graze is a good way to. It's a good thing to wait a little bit before you go for a lot of investments, because it takes time to learn how to understand the landscape once you have learned a few new tools. So there can be information that you will have only when you have been trying to work with this way of managing for a few years. Yeah. We're going to talk more about the grazing planning tomorrow, but the grazing planning, getting the animals to the right place at the right time for the right reason so that we can enhance the total ecosystem services, is a form that we fill in the beginning of the season. I can find another image that we can blow up here. It's not so easy to see, but for those of you who have come in later, we have been talking about how grass is growing. When you want to increase the productivity of your grass, it's important that we are not stressing the grass by grazing it repeatedly without letting the roots recover. After a grass has been grazed, it needs time to recover before the animals come back and graze it again, or else it will stress the roots of the grass. And the recovery time of the grass depends on the time of year, and also the temperature and things like this. But for the most part, grass maybe from 20 to 40 days to recover from being grazed the first time until you can come back and graze it again. So we need to make sure that we are not overgrazing the plants on our property. And the easiest way to do that is concentrate animals so that we have animals grazing all the plants within an area before they are taken away, and letting the whole area recover before they come back. And to do this in practice, we need a form to make sure that we are tracking where we have been with the animals, and also planning where we need to go with the animals. Like I mentioned, this is from the military. It's a planning sheet from the military. And we make one planning sheet for the growing season and one planning sheet for the winter season. Even in Norway, we are grazing, on my farm we are grazing until late March. And when we can extend our grazing season to go 300 days, we are saving a lot of money on making silage for the animals and also transporting the nutrients out of the barns. When it comes to grazing in the winter, it's also interesting to see how little nutrients are lost by leaving the grass out. Of course, depending heavily on the winter conditions, but if it's frost, stable frost, you will have conservation of the grass in a good manner. If it's freezing and raining and thawing and freezing and raining and thawing again, it's decreasing the forage quality. So in order for us to get the animals to the right place at the right time, for the right reason, we have this form, and I think we usually say that grazing animals is a bulldozer you cannot park, so you better know where it's going the next day. Here is the months: April, May, June, July, August, September. And within these columns we have 30 days for each month. So each square represents 1 day. In this column we have our pastures. Pasture 1, pasture 2, pasture 3. All the pastures that you have available for grazing. We also record the size of the pasture and the estimated quality of the pasture related to each other. Since farming in a regenerative way of farming, we need to consider all aspects of our environment and also social aspects. And in order for us to have all this information, we need to have a form like this. Many farmers try to remember all these things in their head, where the animals have been, where they have to go, what kind of consideration it was with the neighbors, when you had a parasite problem in that field, when you are cutting hay, when you can graze the hay field again. All kinds of this information is usually kept in the head of the farmer. And that is very, very difficult because there are so many variables. They say that people cannot control more than 3 variables at the maximum at one time. So when it turns into maybe 100 variables, it becomes quite difficult. And that's when we start having problems on our farms. There's very few things that are as complex as running a farm. So for every month, there will be activities that will affect the whole farm. For instance, on my farm, we have in the beginning of the year, in April, we have sharing the wools of the lamb. So I need to know where do I have my sheep when I'm sharing them for the wool. And then there's another thing happening with my sheep. They are having their lambs. Well, they're having their lambs, and it starts in early May and extends into June. So then I know, okay, that's the period when they're having their lambs. And I also have an estimation on when the grass is starting to grow. Okay, the grass is starting to grow 1st of May. Okay, so if I want my lambs to be born after the mothers have been eating grass for a while and adjusting the rumen so that the microbes are in balance, so they will produce the most milk, and I will get the lambs the fastest possible, I will need to time that. And I also need to know when the grass is growing dormant, when the grass needs to recover before the winter so that I can store as much energy in the roots before the grass grows dormant. If I stress the grass at the end of the season, I will also have very bad growth in the start of the year. So if I take down the grass in the end of the year, I will pay for that in the spring. There's also things like when there's a price, a higher price for my slaughter weights, and also when I will take out the bulls and the rams from the herd, I can put that information in. I also put in things like when we're going on a vacation, so that I can time where the animals have to be in order for us to leave. Also, if I'm going to Estonia, I can put that into my plan so that I know things that I will have to be prepared. So things that affect the whole farm, I put in through the season. But there's also things that are affecting the individual pastures. Well, some pastures are going to have hay cut, and some pastures have a problem with parasites, and some pastures are flooded for a period of time, so they are not available because of the water. And you have wildlife concerns, for instance, birds that are hatching. If you are in a conservation area, you need to take attention to the wildlife. So you can mark that in. So in my grazing plan, I put in blue on some of the pastures where I have problem getting water. And that means that I don't go grazing there when it's the hottest time of the year. I wait to graze here until maybe a period when I know there will be rain. And then I don't have to transport all that water to that area because they will get the water through the grass. Other things is like if you have a pasture with a lot of parasites, you don't want to graze it when it's wet conditions. You want to graze the pasture with parasites when it's hot and dry. So you save that pasture for a time when it's hot and dry. Also, if you're going to have a hay cut, you mark that out, and so that you are not grazing there before the hay cut, and you are sure that it will have enough recovery after the hay has been cut. All kinds of variables that you can think of during the year you put in here. The more you have, the better your plan will be, the better outcome you will have. And for me, from being a farmer, keeping everything in my head, to having this plan out on my kitchen table, so I'm seeing it every day, is making such an relief in my life just to have this visual and I have so much more control on my everyday life now. So it's a very the amount of stress in farming has gone down dramatically. We can have a look on the plan later in the big size format. We also record information about the herd, how many animals we have at any time of year, how many calves, how many heifers, and how much of an animal unit they consist of, and how much weight. Then we can figure out how much carrying capacity the land has through the year. We also need to decide what is the appropriate recovery period for the plants that we want to have. So if you are only considering grasses on your farm, if you are having a pure grazing operations, the only concerns you have is having your grass to recover. But if you are working in a conservation area where you maybe have species that are vulnerable and that is important for the biological communities, and that there are special EU regulations in taking care of, you need to know that you are actually managing for the period of recovery that these plants need. So your recovery time is always based on the recovery period of the weakest plants you want to have. In the spring, early spring, the plants usually need longer recovery because it's still cold and not so much sunlight. But the more sun you get, the shorter the recovery time of the plants will be. So in May, after you have been grazing a plant, it could take only 2 weeks for the plant to recover. And during the summer, it's the same. You have a very effective growth period, so the recovery period will be very short. But as you go into July and August, the recovery period will be longer and longer. After you hit the summer solstice, and the days have been getting shorter and shorter. So you need to take that into account. And when you know what you expect for a recovery period, you can start to record your grazings. There's a calculation to figure out when you have a lot of land and all these variables. You know that you can overgraze grass if you stay too long. If you stay too long, they will start grazing again the plants that are starting to regrow. But you can also overgraze by coming back too soon before the plant has recovered. So we have to figure out what is the longest time we can be in one paddock without coming back too soon to graze it. And there's a calculation that we can go through tomorrow. And when we know that, we can start putting in the actual grazing periods. And we do that by drawing it in with a pencil and not by a pen, because this is our plan. But what actually happens, we have to write in with a pen. So we start in the middle of the growing season, and we start with an event that we know that is very important to us. For instance, going on a holiday is so important for us, or else my wife is going to leave me. So in order for me to go on a holiday, I need to be safe that my animals are in a good place so that I will have no stress when I leave the farm. So by that I know that there's this area down by the river where there is lots of trees and shelter for the animals. Because of the river, there is less damage, less chance that they were going to go through the fences because the river is a good barrier. And it's a place where my neighbor easily can see the animals and give me a call if something is wrong, so they can fix the problem. Okay, so I know that if I'm going on a holiday here, my animals need to be in this pasture. So I mark this pasture for my animals. And this is where the interesting thing starts, because we are planning now backwards. Because if we are going to get our animals to this point, we need to know where they have to be the day before.
in order to get there. So in order for the animals to get here so I can go on a holiday, they need to be this pasture the day before. And to get there, they need to be in this pasture. And to get to this pasture, they need to be in this pasture. And in that way, we are working our way backwards, avoiding areas that are that have different aspects, for instance, water problem, parasite problem. So we are maneuvering our way backwards. If we started planning forwards, and I wanted to have my animals starting here, and I wanted to end up here, it would be a much more difficult task to actually end up there. So that's why we are planning backwards. And we are also just planning half the season at one go, because things will change during the season, and when we are approaching the middle of the season, then we start planning the rest of the season. Yeah. When we have recorded the whole year and everything has gone approximately according to the plan, we are left with very accurate numbers on how much feed, how much grass we are harvesting in our farm. Because for every line here, that's 1 day, and you have recorded how many animals you have. So say I have 100 cows, and they could stay for 3 days in 5 hectares. Then I know how many animals times day divided by hectares. And then we have a number that we call animal days per hectare. That number is a very good estimate to know the amount of forage you have available. When you have done this plan 1 year and you do your next year's plan, then you have actual figures to base your grazing on. And then you can see the next year if you are harvesting more this year than last year, and if your productivity is going up or if it's going down. If it's going down, you have to do some measurements to improve. Yeah. Is everybody following? Do you understand what I'm saying? That's my Norwegian English. Yeah. Should it have a short break?
Yeah.
I'm really sorry because usually it takes 8 days to go through this, and we do it in 2 hours now. So it's, if I'm losing you at the first part, I understand it because it's a lot of different information that we are going through. We're just trying to give you a sort of a small taste of what it is about. So it's more than just a grazing system. It's a process of lifting the overall landscape. And all the aspects of it, economically, the productivity of the landscape, and also the natural functions. All right. What we call regenerative management is to always monitor to see that we are on the right track. Because it's really easy to say that we are doing something, but we also have to show that we are doing something good. So we have what we call a feedback loop. We use this feedback loop when it comes to the grazing plan. We know that we are on the track. Also in the financial planning, we track our expenses. And look for the earliest sign that we are deviating from the plan. But we also do that in something that we call ecological monitoring. So
we have a way of measuring in our farms how the ecosystem functioning is working, and if we are going in a positive direction or if we are going in a negative direction. This way of monitoring, we are now launching this through our organization, the Savory Institute. We are launching a program that is called Land to Market. I'm going to show you a little bit about that later, but Land to Market is sort of a replacement of what we know as organic certification today. Today we have organic certification, but it doesn't really say anything about what's happening on the farm. It just says that you're not using pesticides, you're not using chemicals. It doesn't say, it says that your animals have more space, but it doesn't say anything about animal welfare, if you are rehabilitating your ecosystems. So we want to introduce a way for farmers to measure that they are actually rehabilitating the land. And we call that the environmental outcome verification. Because we are not just grazing, we are grazing for an outcome. We want something to happen. We want a future resource base, something that we have determined in advance. We have decided where we want our landscape to be. We have decided what kind of species we want present, what kind of wildlife, how the mineral cycle must be, how the water cycle must be. All of these things we have decided in advance. And in order for us to know that we are going that way, we need to monitor these outcomes. And if we are able to monitor these outcomes, we have a set of data that can be verified, and we can have a verification stamp that says that we are part of contributing to better ecosystem health. And if you as a consumer buy our meat, our milk, our wool, our leather, you are supporting farmers that are regenerating the world. So this is what we call a no bullshit approach to actually doing something good. You have to prove that you're actually contributing. The way we do this is in the existing monitoring system that we have within the framework of holistic management, as it's called, have now been advanced into a scientific, verifiable set of data. And we have collaborating with the Michigan State University, with the soil scientists there that are collecting the data from the information that we retrieve and putting it into a system. Yeah. We are measuring different aspects of the ecosystems. We are checking the species that are within the ecosystem. We have defined, well, I'm going to go through it, take that later. When we have a farm within a region, it's important that we are comparing farms within the same ecoregion. So the whole world is divided into different ecoregions. And an ecoregion is a recurring pattern of ecosystem functioning that will be similar through a larger piece of land. So you have like the boreal ecosystems, and you have coastal, I don't remember the names, they are very difficult names, all of these ecosystems. But you can see from the map that there are different ecoregions
in the countries, and some countries go through many ecoregions. So like in Norway, we have coastal and Arctic climates in the span. So when we recover data, we cannot just compare a farm here with a farm up here, because there will be different ecoregions. So what we need to do is we have to establish within each ecoregion, we have to establish some parameters on what is the optimum functioning ecosystem within this region. Where is this ecosystem at its best? What types of plant can we achieve? What kind of diversity can we achieve? What kind of productivity can we achieve? When you have done that, when we know what we can be achieved, we can set up a plot on a farm, and we can measure the outcomes on the farm in relation to what's possible within that ecoregion. And then we can see if we are moving away or moving towards. Yeah. And we have already decided how we want our specific landscape to be within this ecoregion. And that means that we have to understand what functional groups of plants that is realistic to have. So one thing that I really like about our way of looking at the environment is it's a bit more pragmatic and practical than what you often experience in academic circles, where I don't know one Latin name of any plant. I almost don't know the Norwegian or English name of the plant either, but that doesn't really matter. The important thing is that you can distinguish functional groups from each other and different plant traits. As we are working, we are managing for as complex and diverse ecosystems that we can. So if I go into a field and I see only 2 species present, and I know that I want to manage for more, this is a very low successional level. We need more species. So the more species you have present on your farm, the happier you should be. So within the functional groups, we describe what type of grasses, what kind of forbs and legumes and trees and shrubs can be expected within this ecoregion. And some of them are desirable according to the landscape that we want to produce, and some of them are undesirable according to the landscape that we want to produce. So we have described what state the ecosystems must be in, and we also have to figure out what kind of transitions can occur for us to go from one state to the other. For instance, when it comes to pastures and grassland, that is one state. If you want to change from a pasture on the grassland into a cropland, for instance, what are the transitions that will occur for us to change from that to that? Well, it could be plowing, seeding, spraying, fertilizing, and then we have a transition that way. Okay, but we want to go from pasture to forest. Okay, what do we have to do that? Well, we have to rest the environment, we have to make sure that we will have more fungi in the soils, and what kind of practices will enhance this transition. And then we have the brush stage, okay, the transition between forest and brush, what transitions will occur for that to happen. So we make a list of the possible transitions, and what kind of actions we can take to go from one state of in the ecosystem to another state. Like we were talking about earlier, we have the successional transition from bare soil to old forest. So this is talking about states. What kind of tools do we use in order to travel on this successional state? There is a... Can everybody see that nice little drawing? Let's say that we have forest in this bottom valley, and then we have a top, and then we have pasture, grass. For us to go from forest to pasture, you have to put in some effort to go over this top. So you can't just transition without putting in any energy. So it's like if you have a ball in the bottom of this slope, you have to push the ball over the top, and then it will fall easily into, once it's past the top, it will easily fall into the pasture state. And then if you want to transition it to bare ground, then you have to put in energy to get it over the top and then into and the same goes the other way. So it needs some kind of effort to change from one state to the other. And those are the states that are possible in our management. Once we know what kind of landscape we want and what states can be expected within our ecoregions, and what types of actions we can do to transition from one state to another, we set up a research plot, taking samples of soil health. So this is let's say this is pasture land, and we set up, this is a long-term plot where we have a panoramic photo of the area, and we put down markers at different lengths, 13 meters and 25-meter transects out here. And for each blue dot, we do soil carbon testing, we do water infiltration testing, we do soil bulk density testing, and what is this here? Yeah, soil biology. And then we get quite a thorough understanding of the state of the soil. But we also need to know the state of what's going on above ground. So we also do an assessment of the soil surface and the plant canopy. So for every transect, 25-meter transect, every 25 centimeters, we do an assessment of the vegetation. What plants are present? Are they densely together or are they spread out? What's the distance between the perennial grasses? Is there bare ground present? In the drier part of the world, bare ground is quite common, and it's very destructive for having a good water infiltration and mineral cycle. So we need to have the soil covered. But in our ecosystems, it's very common to have the soil covered by moss. And what's important for us to know is that moss is our way of having bare ground. If moss is the only thing that is growing, then we have really unfavorable growing conditions. Because moss is growing with nutrients from the air and not nutrients from the soil. And moss also like acidic conditions. So when you have waterlogged soils and no aeration in the soil, the pH of the soil decreases, and moss will establish because moss likes acidic conditions. So these are parameters for every 25 centimeters we measure, and it's really important for us in our management in our everyday life when we are out in our pastures, because we have a tendency to just look out on the pasture and it looks green, but we have to start looking down on our pastures and see what's happening at the soil surface level. That's the first indicator of that will tell us what is going on. Ideally, you want the soil to be covered by living plants, because living plants, they are using water, putting out nutrients into the soil, harvesting energy from the sun. And if you don't have any living organisms, you have to cover the soils with litter, plant vegetation that can break down by microbes. So when you are out in the pastures, you could either feed your animals what's standing there, but if the animals won't eat it, the microbes will eat it. So then the job of the animals is to trample it down so that the microbes can eat the vegetation. So there's two producers you have to feed on your farm. It's the microbes and your cattle. When we are covering the soil, if you have a established microbe community, the dead plant material will be consumed by the microbes. What we often see is that many farms have depleted the soil for microorganisms because the animal impact has been so low that the nutrients that has been distributed through manure has not been increasing the microbial community. So if you dig down into the or not dig, but if you only go down on your knees and you can see the soil surface, and on top of it is dead vegetation, but there's a clear line between the dead vegetation and the soil, then you are having very low breakdown by microorganisms. What you do want is a gradual transition from dead vegetation that is gradually being incorporated into the soil, so that there's no clear line between the vegetation and the soil, that is just translucent. Not translucent, it's blended. Once we start covering our soil and feeding the soil with animal manure containing lots of microbes, we start establishing good microbial communities. So by having this vegetation trampled down, we produce shade for the microbes, and we produce food for the microbes, and an overall habitat. So, and the more brown material, the more straws you put down, the more carbon you put down into the soil, and the more fungi you will get. The more green material you put down, the more protein and the more nitrogen you will put, and then you will have more bacteria in the soil. So we want to balance how you feed the soil with what type of food you give to the microbes. And when you dig down through the grass, it should always be covered by some form of litter. Yeah. So yeah, here's a picture of a test plot set up. So this will be a long-term test plot that will We have monitors coming in and doing measurements so that you can have peer-reviewed data on that you're actually progressing. One important thing to do is taking these photos. We also take photos from each point so that we have also a visual documentation of the species present. And that's just at this point before doing any setup of these kind of registrations. It's good for you to start taking photos of your farms as they are today. And we always carry our smartphones or some kind of phone with us with cameras. So starting to get a habit of documenting the state of the land, taking photos straight down and seeing what amount of bare ground, what kind of litter are present, what kind of species are present. Starting to understand and reading the land better. Yeah. The concept of trampling down vegetation is quite unusual to most farmers. The current view of grazing is keeping it short and tidy, mostly like a golf field. That's the management practice as of today for most of the world. And wasting good grass by trampling it down, it's looked upon as waste. But we think that this is the most important investment that you are doing. Because if you don't return anything into the soil will not give anything back either. So this is a way of investing in the future, of building that soil that you need to hold water and to release nutrients from unavailable sources as of today. Yeah. So just wanted to show. Started at the wrong end. The land to the market program that we are launching now. As the first regenerative verified sourcing solution in the world. We have more and more consumers becoming aware of that their habits are really important for the outcome of the future of the world. And like this graph is showing that the studies show that people are more afraid of issues in the world than about their own well-being. So it's we are for the first time starting to unite as a planet about matters that involves all of us. So people are starting to be willing to change their consumer habits into things that they can trust, but there's so much media on how much bad, for instance, organic farming can be doing compared to conventional farming. And as long as we don't have any good data to support that we are actually doing good, it's not much can be said to combat those claims. Yeah, so there's a whole trend in the world today is going from the technical reductionist worldview and into a more holistic regenerative worldview. And understanding that we really have to consider social and economical aspects, social and environmental aspects as well as the economic aspects. And those organizations that are starting to understand these concepts of fully embracing all aspects of the life as social and ecological and environmental are those businesses that are doing the best financially as well. There's in holistic management we are defining wealth and money in a way that could be useful, and we divide money into 3 parts. We have money that is what we call solar money, we have money that is called mineral money, and we have what we call paper money. So paper money is money that we can achieve through creative thinking, stock market trading, all kinds of sort of human imagination created money. Mineral money are money derived from some what do you call it? Extracting source, for instance, coal mining, oil, bad farming, for instance. If you have farming that is depleting your soils, then you are mining your soils. But we also have solar money, and that's money derived from the photosynthetic activity. And that is the only wealth that can sustain people for as long as the sun is shining. So we need to be aware that we are basing our future on money that is derived from the sun and not necessarily from minerals as of today. Yeah, so there's some what do you call bragging pictures from the work that we have been doing for last 50 years, trying to regenerate damaged ecosystems, getting a photosynthetic activity back functioning. And I've met some of the farmers who have been witnessing these changes, and it's quite remarkable stories how people are on the verge of bankruptcy and have to leave their farms, and changing the whole story into becoming productive grazing and farmland again. So our organization is working on a hub strategy. So our intention is to restore ecosystems. That's our goal. It's not to sell a grazing system or anything like that. We want to restore ecosystems, and that's why we need to verify that we actually are doing that. And our strategy is to oh yeah, that's not so easy to see. There's a map of the world somewhere there. Could we turn off the light in the end? Maybe it's easier to see that. That didn't help at all. Well, there's a world map at least, and here's Norway, and Estonia is here somewhere. So here's the United States, South America, Africa. So we have a strategy to establish training hubs around the world that can facilitate training in regenerative land management. So we are delivering training as well as setting up these field trials for people that want to show that they are growing food in a way that regenerates the ecosystem. So each hub works with scores of farmers in their region, and we have this common protocol that we work by, and I'm going to show that tomorrow. And at the end we will have a sign that will you can mark your goods with when you sell them out. Yeah. So we have some business partners that are helping us distribute this program, because we are a small organization, and to launch a project like this requires some external funding to be achieved. Yeah, so I think that was the fastest I can go through everything.